Joining us, Democratic Senator Elissa Slotkin, who represents the state of Michigan. Have you seen any of the video? Do you still have questions?
Well, sure. No, I haven't seen the video. They haven't shown it to the Armed Services Committee writ large. They they showed it to a few leaders here in the Senate and in the House. And I think we all have questions, including the American public. So the easiest thing to do is just to have the Secretary of Defense come and talk to us, walk us through it, release the video. They've released videos on all the other strikes and some of this strike even. And so let's just be transparent and then let's just move on with it. And I think one of the most important data points of the story, I will just say, is that you have this September 2nd strike where, you have this debate about the double tap and hitting the survivors. A month and a half later, you have another strike that has survivors, and they're handled completely differently. They're picked up, they're repatriated to their home countries very quickly. So certainly something changed from the top down at the Pentagon.
What is stopping Secretary Hegseth from testifying in front of your committee?
Nothing. I think it's just his approach to this, to Signalgate, to other issues is just double down, say nothing to see here, push. I don't think it's a tactic that works. Both Democrats and Republicans on our committee actually are interested in this. And it was interesting, we're about to vote on the Pentagon's budget. And there's language in there that says until and unless the Secretary of Defense releases the video, we're going to withhold his travel funds or part of his travel funds. And I just think it's interesting. That's a bipartisan bill that's now been approved and ready for vote in both the House and the Senate that are saying the same thing.
Yeah, that is interesting. We'll see if it provides any results. There's some new reporting from Venezuela. I'm wondering if you've heard about any of this. The United States has issued fresh Venezuelan related sanctions, adding 6 crude oil tankers to its sanctions list, according to a notice posted on the U.S. Treasury website on Thursday, which could, I guess, mean potentially more seizure of oil tankers off the coast of Venezuela.
Yeah, I haven't seen today's reporting. We've been in votes, but I would just say, the president has put an enormous amount of U.S. force into the Caribbean and off of Venezuela. He's clearly sending a signal. Now there's taking of commercial tankers. Americans have seen this movie, right? We've seen, if you're old enough to remember the run up to the Iraq War, run up to other wars. And I think, the fundamental question, again, is if we're going to have potentially another war, another armed conflict, what is the responsibility of senior leaders to come back to Congress and explain why we would be taking that force in the name of America, the American people?
We need to talk about some absolutely devastating new reporting from the Washington Post that reveals exactly what happened in those moments before the second strike on survivors from that September 2nd boat attack. And I'm also going to share an incredibly important interview with Senator Elissa Slotkin that exposes not just what happened with these strikes, but the death threats and security nightmares she's facing because Donald Trump essentially put a target on her back. This story has so many layers of corruption, violence, and authoritarian behavior that we need to break it all down piece by piece. Let me start with the Washington Post's bombshell reporting, because what they've uncovered based on conversations with 10 people who spoke under condition of anonymity is absolutely chilling. The video feed from that September 2nd strike showed 2 men struggling to stay afloat on wreckage that people who've seen the footage described as roughly the size of a dining room table. These weren't armed combatants. These weren't people operating weapons or posing an active threat. These were shipwrecked survivors clinging to debris, trying desperately not to drown in the open ocean. By the way, I am trying to do my best to gather all the information I can for you and share it with you. Please leave your likes and comments, and I would be grateful if you subscribed. Let's continue. Admiral Frank Bradley, who was commanding the operation, turned to the military lawyer advising him and asked for input. This is according to members of Congress who spoke with Bradley privately and people who were later briefed on those conversations. The question Bradley asked was fundamental to the laws of war. Under the law of armed conflict, were these men now shipwrecked and therefore out of the fight, rendering them unlawful targets? That's the crucial legal question. The Geneva Conventions are crystal clear that shipwrecked persons must be protected. They cannot be made the object of attack. This isn't some obscure legal technicality. This is basic international humanitarian law. Admiral Bradley decided that definition did not apply. He concluded that these shipwrecked men clinging to wreckage were still lawful targets, and his reasoning, based on what he told lawmakers, left some with the impression that there was a prevailing lack of certainty. Bradley apparently wasn't sure if there were actually drugs beneath the wreckage. He wasn't certain whether the survivors had a means to call for help. He didn't know if they intended to surrender. So faced with all this uncertainty, faced with questions about whether these men posed any threat at all, Bradley decided that further action was warranted and ordered a second strike that killed both men. Here's what makes this even more damning. Moments before that second strike, the video feed showed the men waving their arms and looking skyward. People who saw the footage said it was unclear why they were doing so. But come on. Two men shipwrecked in the ocean, clinging to debris, looking up at aircraft circling above them, waving their arms. What do you think they were doing? They were signaling. They were trying to communicate. They were possibly attempting to surrender, or at minimum trying to make themselves visible to avoid being attacked again. And they were killed anyway. This is not a split-second battlefield decision where there's no time to assess the situation. This was a video feed being watched in real time. Bradley had time to consult with a military lawyer. He had time to observe the men's behavior. He had time to consider whether they posed any threat. And with all that time and all that information showing that these were defenseless shipwrecked survivors, he ordered their execution. Senator Elissa Slotkin, who serves on the Armed Services Committee, revealed something incredibly important in her interview. She hasn't seen the video because they haven't shown it to the Armed Services Committee at large. They've only shown it to a few select leaders in the Senate and House. Think about what that means. The people who are supposed to provide oversight over military operations, the senators and representatives who fund the Pentagon and authorize military actions, they're being kept in the dark. They're not being allowed to see evidence of what happened. And Senator Slotkin made a completely reasonable point. The easiest thing to do is just have the Secretary of Defense come and talk to Congress, walk them through what happened, and release the video. The Pentagon has released videos of all the other strikes. They've even released some footage from this particular strike. So why not release the second strike video? What are they hiding? If this was a completely legal and justified military action as they claim, transparency should be easy. But instead, we get stonewalling and secrecy. Slotkin pointed out another crucial detail that I think exposes the whole cover-up. A month and a half after the September 2nd strike, there was another boat strike that also had survivors. And those survivors were handled completely differently. They were picked up. They were repatriated to their home countries very quickly. So clearly something changed from the top down at the Pentagon between September and October. Clearly there was recognition that targeting shipwrecked survivors was problematic. Clearly there was a policy shift to avoid repeating whatever happened on September 2nd. And that policy shift is essentially an admission that the September 2nd strike violated proper procedures. When asked what's stopping Secretary Hegseth from testifying before her committee, Slotkin's answer was devastating. Nothing. There's no legal barrier. There's no legitimate reason. Hegseth's approach to this issue, to the Signalgate scandal, to everything, is just to double down, claim there's nothing to see, and push. He's betting that if he refuses to engage with oversight, if he just stonewalls Congress long enough, everyone will move on to the next scandal and he'll avoid accountability. But Slotkin made clear that tactic isn't working. Both Democrats and Republicans on the Armed Services Committee are interested in this issue and want answers. And there's already bipartisan action being taken. In the National Defense Authorization Act, the Pentagon's budget bill, there's language that says until and unless the Secretary of Defense releases the video of the second strike, Congress will withhold his travel funds. This is a bipartisan bill that's been approved and is ready for votes in both the House and Senate. Republicans and Democrats are united in demanding transparency. That bipartisan pressure is significant because it shows this isn't just Democratic opposition to Trump. This is members of both parties recognizing that what happened on September 2nd raises serious legal and ethical questions that demand answers. When you've got Republicans joining Democrats in threatening to withhold Pentagon funding until they get transparency, that tells you the situation is serious. The interview then moved to Venezuela, and this is where things get even more alarming. The United States has issued fresh sanctions, adding 6 crude oil tankers to the sanctions list, which could mean more seizures of oil tankers off the coast of Venezuela. Senator Slotkin pointed out that Trump has put an enormous amount of U.S. military force into the Caribbean and around Venezuela. He's clearly sending signals. We're now seizing commercial tankers. And Slotkin made a comparison that should terrify anyone who remembers the last 20 years. Americans have seen this movie before. If you're old enough to remember the run-up to the Iraq War, the pattern looks familiar. Senator Rand Paul called the seizure of an oil tanker an initiation of war. When Slotkin was asked if she agreed, she said she doesn't know if that's a technical term, but it's certainly a new and more aggressive move. When you combine the tanker seizure with the sheer amount of American military might now in the Caribbean, it's already cost an estimated $1 billion just to move all that force into the area. You're looking at a new data point toward what Trump has been open about. He's interested in regime change in Venezuela and won't rule it out. Slotkin's response to the idea of regime change was perfect and should be listened to by everyone in Washington. She did 3 tours in Iraq as a CIA officer. She's seen firsthand what regime change looks like. Her assessment, the American public, whether Democrat or Republican, is exhausted with regime change wars. Regime change locked us into 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's easy to start a war, but harder to get out of one. She doesn't know many people who wake up in the morning looking for another regime change conflict that we initiate. Slotkin said she's open to going after drug smugglers, that there's room for bipartisanship and creativity on that issue, but you have to show your math. You have to explain what you're doing, explain which groups you're going after, provide the intelligence behind it. Be transparent, and you'll have allies on some of this. But another war? That requires a conversation with the American people. Congress needs to understand why we would take military force in the name of the American people before we stumble into another decades-long conflict. The interview also touched on healthcare, which is directly affecting hundreds of thousands of people. 500,000 Michigan residents with healthcare.gov plans are about to see their premiums double on average by January 1st. The Senate held 2 healthcare votes and both failed. The Republican plan to put money into health savings accounts failed. The Democratic plan to extend subsidies for 3 years also failed, though some Republicans did vote with Democrats on that one. Slotkin called it a really dark day for people on healthcare gov plans who were already paying more than they could imagine and now face either paying double or going without coverage entirely. And she laid the blame squarely where it belongs. This whole crisis kicked off because of Trump's big, beautiful bill, signed on July 4th, that yanked away the subsidies. The very people who created this crisis weren't interested in fixing it. But Slotkin said she's willing to negotiate with literally anyone on healthcare. She called it one of the existential issues of our time. She doesn't know a single American who thinks they're paying too little for healthcare. We're not settled as a nation on how to do it, and healthcare costs eat up too much of our annual salaries. There's actual room for bipartisanship if there's political will. She's ready to sit down this week, next week, the first week back after holidays, whenever, because people's healthcare premiums doubling or tripling or quadrupling is an emergency. But then the interview got to something that absolutely cannot be ignored, and this is where Trump's authoritarian behavior becomes crystal clear in its consequences. The interviewer asked Senator Slotkin about Trump's social media post accusing her of seditious behavior and saying she should be arrested, tried, and ultimately hanged. Slotkin's response reveals the real-world impact of presidential incitement to violence. She described it as a light switch. The moment the President of the United States said she should be hanged, the number of credible threats she started receiving exploded. The Capitol Police had to put 24/7 security on her and Senator Mark Kelly. She still has that security. They were with her during the interview, just off camera. Her family has been targeted. Her parents have been targeted. Her home has received bomb threats. There was a suspicious package delivered. It just goes on and on. And Slotkin said she doesn't like talking about it much because she doesn't want other great people who are thinking about running for office to decide it's not worth it, but she wanted to make clear what happens when the commander-in-chief, the President of the United States, says a senator should be hanged. It allows everyone underneath the president to say that and worse. She wouldn't wish this on anyone, no matter what party they're from. Let me be absolutely clear about what Senator Slotkin is describing: stochastic terrorism. Trump knows that when he targets someone and calls them seditious, when he suggests they should be executed, his followers will take that as permission or even as orders to threaten and potentially harm that person. He's using his platform to incite violence against political opponents. And it's working. Credible death threats, bomb threats, threats against family members, all because Slotkin and 5 other lawmakers made a video reminding service members of their legal obligation to refuse unlawful orders. Remember, that video didn't name Trump. It didn't accuse anyone of anything. It simply stated a basic principle of military law that Trump himself agreed with back in 2016 when he was on Fox News. But because Slotkin and her colleagues reminded troops of their legal duties, Trump called them seditious and suggested they should be executed. And his followers responded with threats of violence that required Capitol Police to assign round-the-clock security. This is what authoritarianism looks like in practice. This is how wannabe dictators operate. They use their power and their platform to target critics, to make examples of people who dare to question their authority, to create such a dangerous environment that other potential critics think twice before speaking up. Trump wants senators terrified to provide oversight. He wants military officers afraid to question orders. He wants everyone in government operating from a position of fear rather than principle. And it's working to some degree. How many senators are staying quiet about the boat strikes because they've seen what happened to Slotkin? How many are avoiding questions about Trump's policies because they don't want their families receiving death threats? The chilling effect of Trump's behavior extends far beyond the individuals he directly targets. But here's what Trump and his followers need to understand. This doesn't work in the long run. Senator Slotkin is still doing interviews. She's still demanding accountability. She's still asking tough questions about the boat strikes and health care and all of Trump's failures. The death threats haven't silenced her. The security concerns haven't made her back down. If anything, they've probably strengthened her resolve because she understands what's at stake. And Slotkin isn't alone. Senator Mark Kelly is facing the same threats and the same security concerns, and he's still speaking out. The other members of the Seditious Six, as Trump labeled them, are still doing their jobs. Trump's intimidation tactics are failing because these are people who understand that democracy requires courage, that standing up to authoritarianism comes with risks, and that those risks are worth taking. The combination of these stories, the boat strike cover-up, the preparations for potential war with Venezuela, the healthcare crisis, and the death threats against senators who demand accountability, paint a comprehensive picture of where we are as a country. We have an administration that kills shipwrecked survivors and then hides the evidence. We have a president who threatens military action without congressional approval. We have a political party that would rather let people lose health care than compromise with Democrats. And we have a commander-in-chief who incites violence against lawmakers who dare to remind troops of their legal obligations. This is not normal, this is not acceptable, and this is not sustainable. At some point, either the American people push back hard enough to restore democratic norms and accountability, or we continue sliding into full authoritarianism where the president can do whatever he wants without consequences, and anyone who objects faces threats to their life and their family. The Washington Post reporting on the boat strike shows exactly why transparency matters. When you hide evidence, when you refuse congressional oversight, when you stonewall legitimate questions, it's because you have something to hide. If that second strike was justified, show us the video. If Admiral Bradley's decision was correct, explain the legal reasoning. If Hegseth did nothing wrong, testify before Congress. The refusal to do any of those things is an admission of guilt. Senator Slotkin is right that we've seen this movie before. The run-up to the Iraq War followed a similar pattern. Exaggerated threats, military buildup, refusal to let Congress do proper oversight, rushing toward conflict without full debate about costs and consequences. And we know how that turned out. 20 years of war, thousands of American lives lost, trillions of dollars spent, and a region destabilized in ways we're still dealing with. We cannot let Trump drag us into another regime change war in Venezuela based on vague claims about drug trafficking and national security. We cannot allow the Pentagon to operate without congressional oversight. We cannot accept an administration that covers up potential war crimes, and we absolutely cannot tolerate a president who incites violence against senators doing their constitutional duty. The bipartisan pressure for transparency on the boat strikes needs to intensify. The language in the defense bill withholding Hegseth's travel funds is a start, but it's not enough. Congress should be holding public hearings. They should be subpoenaing witnesses. They should be demanding that video be released immediately, and if Hegseth continues to refuse, they should hold him in contempt and consider articles of impeachment. On Venezuela, Congress needs to reassert its authority over declarations of war. The president doesn't get to unilaterally start military conflicts. The Constitution gives that power to Congress for very good reasons. If Trump wants to pursue regime change in Venezuela, he needs to come to Congress, make his case, and get authorization. Seizing oil tankers and building up military forces without congressional approval is exactly the kind of executive overreach that should alarm everyone regardless of party. And on the death threats against senators, there need to be consequences for Trump's incitement. When the President of the United States suggests lawmakers should be hanged and credible death threats follow, that's not protected speech. That's using the office to endanger political opponents. The Justice Department should be investigating. Social media platforms should be enforcing their terms of service. And Congress should be formally condemning Trump's behavior. Senator Slotkin is dealing with death threats, bomb threats against her home, threats against her elderly parents, and 24/7 security because she did her job as a senator. That's unconscionable. That's un-American. And that's exactly what Trump wants. A government where fear replaces courage, where loyalty replaces principle, and where questioning authority becomes literally dangerous. But it's not working. People like Senator Slotkin are still fighting. The truth about the boat strikes is still coming out. The bipartisan demand for accountability is still building. And the American people are still capable of recognizing authoritarianism when they see it and rejecting it. This is the fight we're in. This is what resistance looks like. And this is why we can't give up, can't tune out, can't accept this as normal. Stay informed, demand accountability, support the lawmakers who are standing up to Trump despite the threats, and make your voice heard that we will not accept a president who covers up war crimes, threatens military adventures without authorization, and incites violence against political opponents. The stakes couldn't be higher. Democracy itself hangs in the balance, and what we do right now, in this moment, will determine what kind of country we become. So let's choose to be a country where transparency matters, where laws apply to everyone, where Congress provides real oversight, and where senators can do their jobs without fearing for their lives. That's the America worth fighting for. That's the standard we need to demand. And that's what we're going to keep pushing for no matter how many threats Trump issues or how many videos his administration tries to hide.